I'm going to talk about a certain perspective on consciousness that is addressing the status of consciousness. And I call this perspective virtualism. So when we talk about consciousness, let's quickly define our terms. I see consciousness as the experience of what it's like. It's distinct from intelligence, which is the ability to make models, typically in the service of control. And intelligence, in turn, is different from rationality, which is your ability to reach goals once you've found them, or from wisdom, which is the ability to pick the right goals. Sentience is the ability of a system to act on a cohesive model of the universe, including itself and the relationship that it has between the universe and itself. So basically, it's a system that knows what it's doing. The self is a model of the system's agency. It's what makes the self so puzzling, that is the first person perspective involved. That is that the system is able to notice that there is something that is detecting that it is acting on its own models. So there is a controller that is producing a control model that is in the service of control, and it notices that this control model is driving its own behavior. And it has already discovered the concept of agency as a category to characterize objects in the world. And once it notices that there's a particular agent in the world that is using the contents of its own control model, I think this is when the self of the system forms. And the mind is the entirety of the functionality that is responsible for generating a model of the universe. Consciousness can be divided into phenomenal consciousness, which is the awareness of contents, access consciousness, which allows us to distinguish the mode in which we are aware of contents. For instance, is this perceptual? Is this conditional inference that they are doing? Is this a memory of something? Then we have reflexive consciousness, which is the awareness of being aware of something. And this is different and somewhat separate from the first person perspective, which is a perspectival awareness of one's own agency. There are famously many takes on consciousness. For instance, the idea that physicalism, the notion that there is a causally closed lowest layer of the physical world, and everything that we observe is emergent over it. Idealism maintains that this perspective is wrong. Then there's this idea that there are separate independent domains that somehow interact, which is this strong dualism that is being ascribed to Descartes, Leibniz, Malebranche. And I think that last time it was seriously being championed was by Popper and Eccles. And we have the idea that consciousness might require extending physicalism beyond the notions of computation, which is, for instance, advanced by Roger Penrose. And there's the idea that consciousness cannot be explained at all, which is sometimes called Mysterianism, which is, for instance, championed by Colin McGinn and but also Noam Chomsky. And then there's this pragmatic notion that consciousness is something that we don't yet completely understand, but that there is no deep puzzle that needs to be solved separately, but it's going to fall into place if we continue to study the function of the mind. And in the meantime, let's not talk about it too much. It might even be unscientific to talk about it too much. And this is something that is in some sense implicitly being done by many people working in cognitive science and AI. And then there is the idea that consciousness can be pinpointed as very specific functionality. For instance, Graziano tells us it's the control model for attention, or Joscha tells us that there is a particular prior in the brain that is constructing a low-dimensional function to create a dip in the overall energy function of the neocortex. Basically, the function that makes the biggest difference in achieving coherence in the interpretation of the world. And I am very partial to this notion of the consciousness prior and Graziano's attention schema theory. There is also the idea that consciousness does not actually exist and is an illusion, which, for instance, Keith Frankish proposes. And people like Christof Koch and many others have argued that only a physical system can be conscious, and consciousness cannot be simulated. It's something that is somehow inherent in the way in which biological systems are interacting with the world, and simulations cannot have that property. And I think that this position has it exactly backwards. A physical system cannot be conscious. Only a simulation can be conscious, because consciousness is a virtual property. A neuron cannot be conscious, a brain cannot be conscious. These are physical systems. The reason why you are conscious is because you are in simulation. What is a simulation? Simulation is distinct from physical reality, which is a causally closed lowest layer of the world, and which produces observable causal dynamics. Causality here means it's a property of a model. Causality is the result of taking a domain and partitioning it into separate interfacing objects, right? The universe does not by itself consist of separate interfacing objects. That's a step that we are making as observers to be able to deal with the universe at all, that we basically separate into lots of small sub-universes that each have their own state transition function and rules and evolution. And when you bring them together, they are changing each other evolutions. And this is what we call causal interaction. So causality is a necessary and inevitable property of compressing the universe into separate entities. And when we talk about causal closure, we mean that we have a domain that has no causal interface to objects outside of that domain. And when we talk about physicalism, we mean that there is a causally closed domain in which we can propose separating objects that might interface with each other. We can also treat the entire universe as a global state vector without separate objects, which is in some sense more accurate. But this is basically where causality comes in. Simulation is equivalent in its structural and dynamic properties to what a simulation recreates. But the internal structure that produces the simulation has a different causal form. So for instance, when you look at a computer game, you are looking at a simulation of a circumstance that might be similar to the physical world, right? You could be in a 3D game, the simulated physics, and it's that works very differently than the physics in which you actually live, because it's being implemented as some kind of computer program on a CPU. It's a very different causal structure. And this decoupling of the substrate dynamics and the observable dynamics, the causal dynamics that are being recreated by the simulator, typically require that the simulator is Turing complete. So you have some kind of computer that is able to produce arbitrary state transitions to allow you to produce the system dynamics that you want to have in your simulation. And then we have the notion of a simulacrum, and the simulacrum produces equivalent observables, but there are no underpinning causal dynamics that would allow you to interact with the system. And an example for a simulacrum is, for instance, a movie. A movie produces observables that are similar to the underlying structure. But for instance, such an animation doesn't have a causal structure by itself, right? It's just a sequence of observable phenomena that look to you as if you were interfacing with that thing, but you cannot change its interaction because it has no underlying causal structure. So let's get to consciousness. Consciousness, when we look at its phenomenality, we find that when we go very, very deeply in, that it's basically like being in the inside of the feedback loop. What you notice is at the lowest level, a difference between how something is and how it should be. It's basically like a pain stimulus. And when we zoom a little bit out, we notice many of these dimensions of pleasure and pain. And basically, they all relate to needs, which are aesthetic needs or physiological needs or cognitive needs. And they all make up the texture of the objects that we perceive in our own mind. And so when we zoom out, we notice that there's a binding state of these dimensions into a particular configuration, which means we perceive objects and relationships between them. And when we zoom out a little bit further from this, we go into something that is not directly phenomenal anymore, but it's basically something like a structure that allows us to manipulate the phenomena structure, which means we are now in the domain of reasoning, of planning, of organization of mental representations. And this is at least what the phenomenology of consciousness looks like to me. There's also a very interesting aspect that you can learn to choose whether you perceive something as quale, as whether you are entranced with taking it as a perceptual reality, or making it opaque in the sense that it stops becoming being a qualia, that it becomes instead visible in its nature as a representation. And what we notice in this process is that there's a distinct perceptual process that is generating a model of the world, and the reflexive process that scans it and raises it to conscious content. And there's an index memory of these states that we are making, so we can revisit earlier states in the construction process and perceive them as our stream of consciousness. So conscious attention at some level is indistinguishable from the ability to make index memories. And index memory here means that you can retrieve the memory from a common vantage point. So there's memories being stored throughout the brain and throughout the mind, but typically not in an integrated fashion. You cannot pull them all together, and only from a perspective where you can access them all can you talk about this conscious awareness. And this functionality that we can access memory is not a necessary condition. There is a state of core awareness where you're only aware of the fact that you are aware and you don't have any other content beyond this. And this core awareness is something that you might, for instance, have in a dream or in a meditation state. So sensory experience or the ability to perceive your own agency or even a perspective is not necessary as a property for consciousness. This is contents that come into this. This integrated perspective that consciousness is an integrated model of what you have been attending to or what you're attending to is distinct from how we deal with attention in most artificial intelligence models, especially the transformer, which is basically a statistic over what you should make statistics over. So you don't have in these systems an integrated observer for the most part. The distinction between perception and reflection is something that is pointing us towards dual process models like Daniel Kahneman's System 1 and System 2. Perception is mostly geometric, and the processes of perception are convergent processes, which mean they use gradient descent methods. So you basically identify within the system a direction in which the system optimizes a certain state in which it gets better, so to speak, and then you just follow this direction until no more change is possible, and you have found a local optimum in the state of that system. And this is largely how perceptual processes work. The analytic operations are different. They're typically discrete and constructive, which means that you have to synthesize a program to find a solution. This is whenever the gradient descent doesn't work, you will need to have a memory of which parts of the world you already visited, of the possible state spaces of solutions. And this is a different type of mechanism that happens. It's a different set of operations. And in the way in which our minds work, we seem to be requiring both for many tasks. Our own perception starts out with patterns, which are visual, auditory, tactile, proprioceptive, or their emotional or their imaginations. And we organize those patterns into percepts, which can be environmental percepts or somatosensory percepts or motivational percepts or generally mental percepts. And over these percepts, we integrate a perceptual space, which is something like a game engine. Game engine that is tuned to predict sensory perception and be in sensory patterns and be in sync with them. So it's in some sense an integrated simulation that is the space that we inhabit. The things that we perceive are not the physical world out there. What we perceive is this game engine that the brain is producing, a multimedia story to interpret the world and make it predictable. So things like colors and sounds and people are not out there in the real world. They are part of the mental simulation that the brain generates to make all the patterns on your retina and body surface and proprioception and on the thalamus in general, so also internal patterns, intelligible to the system. And this perceptual space can be roughly understood as three categories. There's a current world state, and this is basically a local state of what the world looks like, or the universe looks like. There's the self, which contains a somatic model and a social model and a model of you as a person, and the mental stage, which has counterfactual imaginary states, like plans that you're making, hypotheses that you're entertaining, memories that you are constructing and retrieving from past situations, and so on. And from these things, you are abstracting knowledge, second order models of the world that allow you to predict what the world is going to look like when your scene changes. And there is an attentional system, something like a conductor, that also gives rise to an attentional self. And this attentional agent lives inside of the processing and motivational system, and is directing certain processes on certain contents. And I imagine this thing to be like a cortical conductor. So if your brain areas are all like something like roughly 50 instruments that are cooperating and producing the music of the mind together, exchanging information with the neighboring instruments and listening to each other, you have a conductor that is very selectively and sparsely and superficially attending to individual instruments, singling them out when it perceives disharmony, and deciding what is being played today and make the entire orchestra coherent and consistent within itself. So it's not some kind of instrument that has superpowers. It doesn't have more capacity than the others, just one instrument among the others. There's a very specific role. So it's able to single out features from the perceptual domain or from the perceptual space. And it does this for the purpose of learning, and is controlled by a part of the self model. And in order to facilitate its control, it has a protocol memory, this states that it attended to. And this gives rise over time to a biographical memory and enables a biographical self. So you remember that you're being strung together into an entity over the past states. And this it gives rise to your notion of identity, of a world line that you have, that you are in a being that is extended in time. And the main purpose of the attentional system is to facilitate learning. So it singles out the parts of the mental representations that need to be associated at any given moment, and the changes that need to be made to the representations. And reasoning, which is a form of real-time learning. It's learning where you construct a mental representation and you make changes in it. You don't have to wait for the world to see the effect of these changes, but they play out immediately in your mental stage, so you can undo or reinforce them and then go to the next stage. In this sense, attentional learning in real time on the mental representation itself can be understood as being identical to reasoning. And this also explains why attention is so crucial to reasoning. So to sum up, attention is enabling consciousness, and consciousness is an integrated model of the contents of your attention in this perspective. And the phenomenal consciousness is a working memory representation of the binding state that the working memory is in. So it singles out parts of the current binding state that you have instantiated in your working memory, and looks at parts of these elements and to combine them. And the mode in which you are attending to it, that is your access consciousness. And the way in which this is organized in your own mind is using processes of self-organization. So this attentional process has to ensure that it is indeed performing a particular kind of attentional role, which gives rise to a very peculiar kind of loop in our own type of consciousness. That is, our own consciousness is oscillating between the awareness of a content and the awareness that this is the conscious process that is aware of that content. And while you can basically ignore all the other contents and go to a state where you have pure reflexive awareness, the reflexive awareness is important so you don't space out. If you don't have that online, if you don't check for the fact that this is indeed the process of consciousness, of conscious awareness, you will typically drop into a state of unconsciousness. And virtualism is the position that consciousness is not physical, that physical systems cannot be conscious. All experience that we are having is virtual, And consciousness and you yourself as a conscious agent is partially a simulation and partially it's a simulacrum. And it becomes more and more a simulation by our own reverse engineering of our own psyche, using the processes of consciousness and the process of awareness itself. So it's not that we are born with a certain notion of consciousness that is static, but it's something that is being differentiating itself and developing as we go up and become more aware of our own agency and the structure of our own agency, the structure of our own conscious perception, the structure of our own self. And this point that experience is virtual is really crucial in trying to understand the world. In our own culture, there is a very prevalent misunderstanding of the nature of consciousness due to the fact that people in our culture typically believe or been taught that we perceive is the real world, the physical world. So that the world of perception is basically the world that we are in. And the world of perception is a simulation. It's a simulation generated by something that is outside of the world that we perceive, by a mind on a higher plane of existence. And this higher plane of existence is the brain of a primate, as far as we know. And the level of reality where the brain of the primate exists cannot be accessed by us in any way. It's a pattern generator. That is something that we can say without loss of generality, but this pattern generator is producing observables. The best model that we have for the nature of that pattern generator is that it's a physical universe in which evolution is possible, where something that can be described or modeled as molecules exist, that something that can be modeled as cells exists, something can be modeled as brains exist. And inside of such a brain, there is a software structure. And the software is a very specific physical law that is generating a model of what it would be like to be a person. And the fact that this person experienced something is by virtue of that being written into that multimedia narrative that the person is part of, right? So the reason why you have emotions and why you perceive these emotions and feelings and experiences as real is because it's being written into the story in the same way as it is written into the narrative of a character in a novel by the author. This is what I wanted to get across for the purpose of this discussion. So I think we might be able to have a couple of questions, but maybe we postpone this to the end and to the panel, so we don't have enough time for discussion, because I think I tried to be fast, but I took up 25 minutes and would like to proceed to our next speaker.